One, welcome back, everybody. This is CSUN Performance Ensemble presents In Conversation with. That is so hard to say. My name is Fernando Martinez. I am one of your hosts.
My name is Jefferson Denham, and I like saying your name, Fernando Martinez. I can say it for you. My name is Jefferson Denham, another host, and
I am Samantha Garcia, and I am another host.
Yeah, so we've been gone for a couple of weeks. I think 2 weeks, maybe week and a half.
okay, dear audience, we were just trying to figure this out. Is there something in the skies? Is the moon in a certain phase? Because we've all been just rocked emotionally,
Yes.
and maybe you're feeling it too. So we're emerging from that. Maybe you're emerging from that, and we're ready to have a nice conversation and hang out together.
Yeah. Mental health issues was strong with this group in the last 2 weeks. It's been rough. But
Wow.
we're all here. We're doing good, and it's good to be back with one another. Yeah, I think it's good to have these, like Simon, like you were saying earlier. I think it's good to have these conversations. I think it's just good for, I mean, just for the purpose of this podcast, right? So for PE, but also for our own health. But that being said, let's get into some very serious topics. So a lot of what we're going to talk today, a lot of what we're going to talk about today, is going to use HB1, a law that was recently passed in Florida. It's called the Combating Public Disorder Bill, as context for a larger conversation that we want to have surrounding our right to protest, the power of language and the power of freedom and performance and sort of things in that same vein, right? And so real quick, I want to go over some of my notes that I have on the bill itself, just to provide context for anybody that's listening. So this bill introduces new crimes and penalties to the act of, and I'm using the language of the bill, rioting and acts committed while rioting. Right. It was a 20-page bill, and essentially, in those 20 pages, a lot of the arguments were in favor that it includes financial sanctions for those who deface or destroy public property, as well as historical sites and monuments. Again, in context, this was passed in what we consider the South, right, or near the South. So I think a lot of that is important too to think about when we talk about monuments and historical sites. The governor who passed it, DeSantis, claims that it is the strictest anti-rioting bill in the history of the state and the nation, right? And it's something that he was very proud of. And so a lot of people who are arguing in favor of the bill, that's what they're saying, is that it introduces a lot of sanctions. And we're going to talk about it because there are a lot of things that people are arguing against it, right? So one example that I wanted to bring up were some of the crimes that they're introducing in this bill when protesting. And I'm using protesting, not the word rioting that is used in the bill, because they're trying to use it interchangeably, right? But for example, some of the crimes or sanctions that they included, and I'm going to list on the bullet points. So it says that if cities in the state, so cities in Florida, allow protests to happen, the state will be allowed to remove funds from those cities. And typically those funds are going to be social welfare and benefit programs, right? So let's think of, what's that program that you did, JD? Because I know that you did something for the homeless population.
Yeah, there was a group. Yeah, there was a group I belonged to for a while. I'm sorry, I'm getting some messages from my. I'm trying to read your document, and it's giving me some issues. I don't know why. I'm going to protest against this software right now. Right. So we used to go out. Actually, it was like 6 days a week. The guy who ran it, and he would go gather people from all walks of life. Anybody could volunteer. We would make a little bit of food, and then you'd go right into Skid Row, and you'd see how people were living. And after we had dispersed the food, he would take us around, and he would tell us how many women had. You basically, all the horror stories. And he says, now, why is it that, just to show you that we are equal opportunity as far as holding people to task, he was saying, why are we in the bluest of blue states with a blue governor, blue mayor? Why is this happening? I just found that to be a really profound question. And so no one is immune. And I should say no one is should be let off the hook. So I know we're going to delve deep into the language of this bill, but I think that what he was pointing out, and I think what we're going to discuss too, is that there are ways of looking at an issue that keeps it confused, that muddies the water and does not address a more systemic root problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason why I brought that up real quick, for the reason why I asked you to bring that up real quick, is just because I want to contextualize our place in all of this, right? Granted that this is happening in Florida, but these are things that we've experienced ourselves, right? So when we think of like social welfare or benefit programs, we think of temporary assistance for needy families, right? The TANF. We think of the food stamp program. We think of Medicaid, housing assistance, which a lot of people had to like, you know, use, especially in the last year because of the pandemic. And then if I had to situate myself, when I was growing up, throughout my years in elementary school, you know, I had to. The only reason I was able to eat anything was because I was on a social welfare program, right? It gave us little tickets that substituted cash, so we didn't have to pay cash for lunch. It's the only way I was able to eat. So a lot of us can situate ourselves in these sorts of social welfare programs. And I don't know, Sam, if there's something that you've experienced. You don't have to share, but if you want to, or if you can, you know, I do want to give you the room. But yeah, it's insane to think about that. That's one of the arguments that this law is trying to make, right? Saying that we can take away all your money if your city allows protests to happen. And the reason I bring that one up is because I want to sort of talk about what, I don't know, what protesting means, right? And so this little bit that I had was that we have, for eons, witnessed injustices, be it personally or in news media, right? Whether it be video or print, whatever, we've seen so many injustices happen. Yet somehow over the summer last year, we experienced something that really shook the entire country. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that we were stuck at home, right? We were almost forced to witness something that we know happens, but have never been as vocal about until now. And although we don't really think of protesting as a right, even though it is, I want to know what you guys think about um, this idea of protesting, this idea of standing up. What does it mean to you, both in the context of what's been happening and just generally? And I want to start with you, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, going to your first question, really my experience with things like the welfare programs is my father actually works for the social services. He's a supervisor there, so he signs off for people's welfare, and it's something that I've seen personally. Like for him, really helps a lot of people. So I think that's kind of weird language to say if people are allowed to protest, we take away that whole resource. Like that just doesn't click in my brain. That doesn't make sense to me. Um, but what was the second question? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, the second question was, thinking about that place, how you situate yourself in terms of, obviously you have experiences with these like social welfare programs through your dad who works in them, right? So you know what it means to people. And then you think about this bill that was passed that says if you protest, we'll take it away. Um, and then given everything that happened since the murder of George Floyd, right, where we were stuck and forced to witness a murder, which is sickening because you can actually see the whole video. Um, all of that all of that as context. What do you think of the act of protest, of speaking out, of standing up? What does it mean to you?
For me, it's people that they get impacted by others. I think it really has a lot to do with just compassion. I feel like the protests that had to do with George Floyd and all everything that was going on was an act of extreme compassion from people who don't even know this person, but it's regardless of how you look at it, it's a heart opening kind of situation. It is people, you know, people with their hearts bleeding for someone else. And I feel like the right to that, the right to act upon that is important, because, you know, we are all innately, you know, loving, we're all inherently loving creatures, and, you know, being allowed to show compassion in whatever form it may take is, I believe, is important.
And so then a quick, because I want to get to you too, JD. But a quick follow up to that, um, because I feel like I know that the three of us are typically in sort of the same headspace when it comes to this sort of thing, right? That regardless of what people believe, we believe that people are innately good, right? Like we're born clean slates, and a lot of these things are learned things. They're not something that you're born with. But then what does it mean to protest? What does it mean to stand up when you know that there is a side who believes that because somebody has a certain history, the whole protest is void? It doesn't mean anything anymore, right? A lot of the arguments, a lot of the rhetoric that was being used, the bonus points for using the word rhetoric, but a lot of the rhetoric that was being used was, oh, but they have a criminal past, you know, as if trying to justify the act because they had a criminal past. What does it mean to protest when you know that there is a side who will argue these things against it?
Are you asking me or Sam?
Either.
Well,
Go ahead, Katie.
can I just say something about that? First of all, I want to answer your initial two questions in reverse order, and incorporate your last question as well, Fernando. So Sam was making reference to the fact that most of humanity, unless you're Jeffrey Dahmer or some asshole like that, you have the capacity to feel empathy. But if you've ever been around a pure narcissist, you can see the antisocial behavior of someone who is a sociopath, has an issue. Now, what these laws are doing is appeal. I believe, like you said, Fernando, we have a clean slate, but we can be appealed to and manipulated by rhetoric, by framing theory, by pick your communication topic. But so you can own the argument by saying, well, here's the prism that with which you gotta, or the, how you gotta look at this issue. And you can turn people one way or the other by how you appeal to people. Now, you can say, what does it feel like? Not to get all religious here, but when Jesus used the Good Samaritan parable, he's telling his audience, do you see how this feels? When someone's down and out, understand how that feels and look what it's like to put on this, clothing of compassion and show up. Well, there's a way for people to feel it and make it stick, or make people really resonate with their soul. However, the other side can be appealed to, which is how to hate the other. I mean, I was just listening to a podcast. Everyone I'm sure in our audience knows this, but up until about the 1910s, 1920s, if you were Black, Irish, Italian, or Jewish, you were on the same plane, and white Protestants hated you. It's just the way it was. Then the power structures realized, okay, now these guys could gang up on us, so let's split them up. So they would tell the poor white people, hey, at least you're not Black. And that's how you could appeal to people's, unfortunately, selfish behavior. We have those capacities. Now, which one do we feed, right? Let me get back to I think this is what you were alluding to as well, Fernando, the people who riot, people who push against the norm. Well, I think everyone knows this quote. Martin Luther King said, riot is the language of the unheard. All right, so if everything's working for you just fine, oh yeah, you want to keep the status quo. You want to keep law and order. You want to freeze things in place. But the thing is, nothing is ever stagnant. Everything's fluid. And this is another thing when you look at history. It seems to me you finally make some progress looking at the 60s, the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Act, and a lot of that progress that was made in mid-60s. There was a lot of pushback in the 70s and 80s. And I was just listening to a podcast about this very thing. So it's a jumble of information. I'm throwing it all at you. You can please respond or say you're full of it. But you can see, like, there was such a pushback against it that it's almost like you were out of step with fashion if you still decided to, oh, that old trope sticking up for Black people. You know what I'm saying? And so luckily for humanity, last summer, there was a very powerful response. And like Fernando, like you said, we were all stuck at home. So we're watching the horror show of people of color being shot and killed by police. Well, after you see that for the fifth, sixth time, and then you look back in recent history and you realize, okay, that's been going on for a long time. What is your response to that? More law and order? Let's tamp down any protest, any voice against the status quo. Obviously, the status quo is not fucking working for a large swath of humanity. Can I remind our audience, the majority of the earth is colored people. Whites are the minority, my friends. So unless you want to live in a South Africa, I don't, then I think it's our responsibility to, I'm combining what both of you have said, to feel compassion, like Samantha said. Okay, what if it's not impacting me personally? Does that mean I should let it go or not sit? No. In fact, it's on us if we have a voice, if we have a position of power. I think we talked about this before too. Especially on us to say, we got to do something about this. So there's a lot of rambling there, and I hope I covered part of what your question was about.
And I think everything you said just really proves the reason why it is so necessary to have the right to protest, truly.
Yeah, and I think too, and so another, because obviously, like, we did some research on this too, but like one of the points that I was mentioning, that a lot of the groups that are protesting this bill were saying what it means to introduce a bill like this, right? And the reason why I'm bringing it up is because of how much money it's predicted to cost if it goes into effect and people start employing it, right? If essentially if police start employing this bill, and it was Dr. Rick Harper, who's a professor of economics and a current economic advisor at a firm, did an independent research study, and he found that it would cost anywhere between $6 to $17.5 million to carry this bill in the state of Florida alone. And the reason why I bring that up is, then what does protest mean if laws that are written could cause the taxpayer, so the people, to essentially lose $17 million over the freedom to protest, right? So what does it mean? Like, how problematic is that? Like, I don't even know. Like, what do you think about it, JD?
Well, I think, just quickly, I'm just going to say that this law, okay, $17 million to implement it, but it's also a lot, let's face it, much of the judicial system of policing in this country, if you don't believe me, please don't believe me, look it up for yourself, is based upon keeping people of color controlled. It's just a fact. And so I'm just going to harken back to one thing you said earlier, Fernando, and that is, okay, so let's say someone's marked as someone who has done time in prison or in jail. Well, if the laws are skewed to a certain demographic to make sure that they're going to break the law more often than this group over here, and then you're surprised that they have a record, I don't think anyone should be surprised. Now, I think that's kind of like intentional, dare I say. What I'd like to know in this law is, does Governor DeSantis, does he apply the same view towards those who stormed the Capitol on January the 6th? Seems to me that was a riot. Seems to me. But everybody gave them a pass. Yeah. Anyway, so this is a little hypocritical.
Yeah, and it's exactly, so this is, I'm glad that you brought up what happened not that this is a funny matter, but I'm glad that you brought up what happened at the Capitol, because I want to move on to the next thing. And I think that it's ironic but also funny that as communication studies majors, the three of us who have been there, that we don't bring up the use of language as often as we probably should. And And the reason why I bring that up is because, after discussing the whole passing of HB1, I want to know um, what role language plays, and do you find it dangerous? And the reason why I bring that up, after you mentioned the whole capital thing, is because no, he clearly. This is how you know that something, to me, this is how you know that something is biased, something is skewed. Is that the language itself in the bill is very vague, right? Florida already has existing bills that is meant to be applied or target people who are protesting. They already have these laws, all right? They're already written in a much more concise manner than the one that is in this bill. And in this bill, and this is a point that a lot of counter protesters bring up, is that the bill itself makes absolutely no effort to heighten penalties, right? To increase the penalties for people, for example, who are driving cars and happen to run over a protester, which is something that we've seen. Where was it? North Carolina, I think, where they ran over a woman who was protesting. I think it was an alt-right. It was neo Nazis, right, that ran over this woman because they were protesting. And in this law, they make zero clarification as to what happens if somebody is driving something and they happen to hurt or kill someone, right, who is protesting. But specifically, if that person is protesting, right? So I guess the law only applies if they're not protesters, right? Then you can get in trouble. But if they're protesters, what does it mean? They don't know because it's so vague. And so that being said, what role does language play? Um, and basically, why is it so fucked up? Why is language so fucked up? How is it so powerful? I know it's a really big question, Sam, but I
No,
don't.
yeah, no. Language and rhetoric is it's always dangerous, especially, in the media and the news and the way I feel like nothing that is displayed to us, like to the general public, is never what it is. And what so the language in a bill and like leaving out linguistic details that could get, a targeted group in trouble over another is super dangerous. And I feel like that language always, it spreads and it becomes distorted, and we make, the masses believe a certain way. And since the bill is like 20 pages, right? Who in the general public is actually going to read the entire bill? Maybe you will, Fernando. I'm sure you will. But there are things that can be missed and that can be distorted and that can really target, certain people. And I just think that's very dangerous.
So, again, a very hard question to answer, but like, so if we recognize it as becoming dangerous, right? If we can sort of pinpoint as close as we possibly can to when the moment that it becomes dangerous, how do we stop it? Like, what do we do about it?
I speak up, stand up, or but how do you do that, right? In a sense of when it comes to like details, and like how do you just like, okay, they missed that, I'm gonna protest real quick, so I don't know, what does Jeff think?
Yeah, and that's the thing too, real quick, JD, because because of what Sam said, because her initial response like was because it's a genuine response, right? Because it was immediate. It was like your answer was to protest. But it's like, how do you protest if this bill exists, right? Like that's the whole point. It's such a vicious cycle. So how do you stop it from being dangerous? How do you stop language from affecting others?
Mm. I would say, let me also address something that you were bringing up originally, and then I will get to that one. But as far as language being powerful, right? Um, I would love our audience to look up Edward Bernays. It's just like I'm endlessly fascinated with this dude, and he's the father of modern day PR and advertising. And all language is calculated. Think of all of the, um, you know, interest groups, or not interest groups, focus groups, where they test out this, that, and the other phraseology. Which words will you respond more to? And really, I think that means which words will you let be a dog whistle for you so that you stop thinking and only react. So words are super powerful. And if you look up Edward Bernays, you'll see how he looked at us as a populace saying we should all be trained to be happy machines. And it would just make, so they justified it thinking that we're making us all content. And it sounds very much like the Matrix. but as far as like, okay, now what do we do when we know language is being manipulated so that we disengage cognitively? Well, education certainly is probably the biggest way, which is why so many people of the political persuasion that tend to be conservative put down education, because it makes you guess, rethink rather than guess your own point of view, rather than being dictated to from anything that's like you've been taught from a parent or a teacher or whatever to accept as normal, when maybe it shouldn't be normal. Maybe there should be some pushback, but there is a vested interest in the powers that be to utilize language to keep us all placid, to make us think this is normal. If you step out of this, you're abnormal. Whereas most research will tell you there's no such thing as normal. It's just what we all decide is the right thing to do. And so, as far as combating it, the best thing to do, in my view, is to educate yourself and try to encourage others to educate themselves. Education. When I was getting my master's, finishing my master's at Fullerton, I was in a media studies class that talked about a great class that would so benefit humanity would be a media studies class where you recognize, Sam, to your point, how the media uses language and comes at us and tries to manipulate us, and to buy this, that, and the other, to say that this is, I don't know if you saw this, by the way, sorry, tangent. Oh, look, a bird. There was an article I just read that was saying that the idea of what's pretty, what's attractive has been shifting intentionally. So like the company, the powers that be are saying, now I want population, I want you to think this is attractive. And there's actually a concerted effort to make it so. Yikes.
Yikes.
Yeah, and it's just another really quick thing too that isn't even necessarily about this bill, but it's just something that's been that we've been seeing, or I can imagine we've been seeing a lot in the headlines is the Israeli-Palestine conflict, right? And I mean, it's been going on for what, since like the 1960s, or at least, probably since the 1927, I believe. But a lot of what we're seeing with that in the use of language, right? That obviously there are multiple sides to the story, but essentially a big part of the conflict is just over land, right? Over who settles what land.
And Fernando, can I interject something?
Yeah.
And I want you to keep going, but just let me just say this quick thing. I just saw a post this morning saying, I stand with Israel. Okay, so there are some potent words there.
Yeah.
And what they're saying is, don't question my loyalty to Israel. They can do whatever they want to do, is what they're suggesting. But because it's a dog whistle word, you go, well, yeah, okay, I stand with, it's the only democracy, blah, 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 in the region. And so there's a use of language that's meant to stop you from thinking, I stand with Israel, or America, love it or leave it. There's like certain phrases that are meant for you to shut everything else down, like as if that's the mic drop.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and I bring this example not because I'm taking a side, right? Though I do.
I'm not either, by the way, but the idea of language, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And again, like and I'm only saying that for anybody that's watching because I am not taking a side, not because I feel like I shouldn't. I do take a side. It's not even important to this conversation. But the reason why I brought that point up, though, is that if I were to make an oversimplification as to why there is a conflict, it is over land, right? Over who sees that land is rightfully theirs. And obviously there's a lot of policy that went into it. There have been wars that have been fought over. It's just a lot has happened because of that, right? But what's interesting to me is that because I do have not just Jewish friends, like practicing Jewish friends, but I have Israeli-born friends. And I also have friends who are practicing Muslims who identify a lot with the people of Palestine, right? Even though they're not Palestinians. But what's interesting is certain phrases that we use. So, for example, that's actually the example I wanted to use was I stand with Israel, right? That's not an issue, but when you say stuff like I stand with whatever country, it doesn't even have to be Israel, it can be any country. you largely ignore a lot of the things that um, come into play as a result, right? Because obviously not every Israeli is a bad person. That is stupid to say. But a lot of things that are happening, and by U.S. funded, no surprise there, Israeli troops that are in what is Palestine now is an issue, right? So if you're saying I stand with X, but this is what they're doing, then you're ignoring an issue. And that's how words work. It's the same thing with that other phrase that you used with America, love it or leave it. So then we can't be upset about something like, like if you don't like how politicians, or I mean, last presidency, if you don't like our president, then leave.
And you know what, Sam, I want to ask this to you. So recently, we've all heard that the U.S. government has acknowledged the genocide that happened in Armenia about 100 years ago.
Hmm.
And there's a word that the Turkish government absolutely forbade anybody to use. If you want to be an ally with us, United States or anybody, you cannot call that a genocide. That word means we did something wrong. Now, to what Fernando was just saying, Sam, what do you think about that? Like, here's a government that says, I want you to all never use this word again. I just feel like as soon as you say that, I think of it and I want to say it, right? So
The
would
word
you
genocide?
genocide? So they do not want to call what they did, which was really murder, about 1.5 million, some say 2 million
Yeah.
Christians. That's a genocide. Sorry. So what do you think about that frantic act of trying to control just one word?
I think that's like I think that's like you said, frantic and almost like a desperate act, to save face, if that makes sense, because it was a genocide. Like, it's I think that is a frantic, desperate act to ignore the facts of it, because we have language, we have words that mean things, and genocide is what happened. So I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just sort of adding to that, though. I mean, if this is not the best like case for taking a rhetorical theory class or a rhetoric application class, right? Like, it's just the way that we use language and how language is loaded and what it means when we say certain things. Um, I think another one of my favorite ones, and we always talk about this, is always the response to the phrase Black Lives Matter is um, Blue Lives Matter, right? And it's just like, you're not even upset about it. Like, that's just a response to the phrase Black Lives Matter. It's not an actual movement. You don't stand for anything.
The rhetorical game.
Yeah, or saying all lives matter. That's the one that pisses me off the most, is saying all lives matter. I'm like, well, no, duh, but that's not what we're focusing on. Or when my own community does it, because they do it so much and it pisses me off, is when they say, oh, but Mexican lives too. And I'm like, nobody ever said anything about it. Nobody ever said no. You're just trying to be upset. Like, that's not what we're focusing on. And so that's the reason why I also brought up the conflict that's happening right now. Um, is because I do have friends who are like Israeli born, and some of them were posting how like they were upset because they've noticed a rise in anti-Semitism, which is awful. Like, that's not. You can be upset with Israeli policies, right? You can be upset with U.S. policies because a lot of the money that they have in terms of arms, right? So a lot of the weapons that Israel has comes from the money that the government here is sending over there, which they've sent over $600 billion, right? That's our money. That's taxpayer money. You can be upset about that. Doesn't give you an excuse to be an anti-Semite, right? Like, that defeats the purpose. So I understood why this person was upset. But then this is where language got dangerous, because this person started saying like, "Oh, but I will stand and defend Israel all day, any day." And I'm like, that's where we're also wrong. Like, you can love Israel. That's not an issue, right? You can be proud of where you're from, but the moment that you say things like that, it's almost as if you're condoning the things that are happening under that phrase, because it is that same phrase that is being used when attacking or hurting or bombing a group of people, right? Because that's what's been happening. And so that's why I bring that up. And then, man, I wanted to make this a sort of tie into the next thing that I want to talk about, and that is continuing an argument that we have made on this show a handful of times, but a lot recently, on accountability versus cancel culture, right? So accountability, if I had to define it for people, because people still don't know the difference, is I'm feeling very sassy today. I was really, it's just, people just don't know
I
how to
love that
argue.
fire, Fernando.
People don't know how to argue, and it pisses me off. you know, um, but to define accountability is just making sure that those who have done or said something wrong, hurtful, hateful, or dangerous meet the repercussions of their actions. Right. Um, this is done with due diligence. It is done with evidence. It is done with sound arguments. Whereas cancel culture is something that typically happens as a sort of reactionary movement, right? We just respond with our feelings before we are able to process something completely, right? Um, if because like if somebody were to say, um, all lives matter, right? Let's just use that for an example. I can respond heated, but that's not going to get me anywhere. I'm just going to hear the phrase, understand why they said it, realize that they're wrong, and then argue why they are wrong and provide evidence, right? Um,
Do you feel, I'm sorry to interrupt you,
yeah.
but Sam, do you feel like just like there's all kinds of dog whistle words, I almost feel like when people say white lives matter, they know that if you're a progressive, you'll lose your shit and you won't know what to say. You're so, it's like a dog whistle word in a reverse way. Do you think?
I I think so. Like, do you mean
Like
like
they're using it to like mess with our, if you're a progressive, mess with your head so that you just like you said, Fernando just said, he it just pisses him off.
I honestly I think maybe it could be, but I think I can't know unless I'm in the shoes of that person, just to be honest. And maybe, possibly, it could actually be their under their understanding, and they're not really like trying to provoke something else, not like coming from no side, but like it's almost like their understanding of, you know, it could be wrong, but it's their understanding of what the issues are, and that they're kind of like they're just looking out for their own, you know what I mean? It could be something like that, but it could be either way. I'm not quite sure, but that's a really good question.
Just wondering. By the way, can I just say, Fernando, to something you said, have you guys seen LeVar Burton's response to the term cancel culture?
Mm-mm.
Oh, I just love it. So LeVar Burton from Reading Rainbow, he's in the running to host Jeopardy.
Oh.
He, he was on The View. I found this article, so I'm just going to read a little bit of it. And he says the term is a misnomer and should be replaced with consequence culture. In terms of cancel culture, I think it's misnamed. I think we have a consequence culture, and that consequences are finally encompassing everybody in society. So in other words, okay, cancel culture, if you think that there's a misuse of a good thing, I get that. But don't you think that sometimes there's consequences to things that have happened either throughout history or even recently? Consequence culture. So people are now, if there's a backlash, it's a consequence of bad behavior. It's not always cancel culture. Here's why I say that. I was watching an excerpt from Fox News the other day, and they had on the guy who owned the winner of the Kentucky Derby, who has been found to have, had drugs in its system, performance enhancing drugs, right? Sorry, that's what they found. So they have him on, and in the midst of him talking to him, he says, well, this is just part of cancel culture. I'm like, no, dude, no, this is not part of cancel culture. You were caught red-handed and you're trying to spin it, speaking of using words, right? So it is such a flippant phrase for people to just pull out because, again, it's a dog whistle phrase. People have always, I think, all walks of life have experienced feeling canceled, right? You're not listening to me, you're invalidating me. And so this phrase is meant, I believe it's been manufactured and meant to trigger, it's a dog whistle phrase so that our mind is completely disengaged. But I believe there's a difference between cancel culture and consequence culture. I just really like that phrase.
Yeah. So to respond to both of you, like, I mean, honestly, JD, like, I look at it and I say this as somebody who is not a parent, obviously, but it's like taking care of a child, right? Like, if your child does something they're not supposed to, you have to call them out, or else you'll keep rewarding their bad behavior. Same with the dog, right? Like, if Pandora starts like, munching on my shoes, and if I don't say anything, I'm rewarding her bad behavior. I have to say something, or I have to call her out, because she's a little monster, right? Um,
Yeah.
but then referring back to the use of language again, just real quick before I ask the next question that I wanted to ask, was because I think Sam brought up a good point, that there are people who um, will make an argument or present a view that is different than our own, not because they are trying to be a villain, but just because that is what they believe, and is not being done in a harmful or intentionally harmful way, though it can still be harmful, right? But it's not intentional. That makes sense, right? I think the best example I like to use, and I do this with my students all the time, is like I always tell them, it's like, look, I think all politicians are stupid, right? But I do tend to swing very hard to the left. You both know that too. And I have zero problems saying that in class. And I also have zero problems if any of you disagree with me. In fact, I encourage you to disagree with me because I don't want you to believe every single time I say something. I don't want you to think of me as being capital T truth, because I'm not. Um, so there is no problem with people who believe that there is fiscal policies, that there are financial policies that are better, that it is better to be financially conservative, for example, if you belong to the conservative party, than to be um, paying all these taxes and paying for all these programs, even though I don't agree with that, right? But it is okay. That is not an issue. I think, though, that that doesn't apply for when people say all lives matter. At that point, it doesn't, like, you fucked up. Like, it doesn't even apply to you anymore. If you tell me, like, yeah, I'm a conservative, cool. That's, I hope it's not your whole personality, but that's cool. Like, it's not an issue. Um, it's when we use dangerous language that I think it becomes an issue, right? So when we start saying that, um, again, the conflict, a lot of like the Zionist movements, right, where we believe that a land is holy, but only for a certain group that believe a certain thing, but not for the other. That becomes dangerous. We look at what happened. I mean, the biggest example of like ethnic cleansing, what happened with World War II, right? Where they believe that the Aryan race was superior. That becomes dangerous. All these things become dangerous. When we saw an increase of, what was it again, 600% or 6,000% of violent acts against Asian Americans, again, words. It's literally words, right? And we've been talking about this whole time. So yeah, that was that. Going back to the whole cancel culture thing. Um, okay, so accountability versus cancel culture, right? Um, okay, so how do laws like the ones that we were talking about with HB1, right? So how do laws change the way that we wish to approach accountability, right? When somebody does, not just say, but does something that is incorrect and we want to fix it, right? How does it change the way that we respond to wanting to have these people be accountable for what they did, when you have politicians, policies, and the wealthy who fund a lot of these policies, making it very difficult for people to respond to it, right? How do we hold people accountable? How do we hold officers like Derek Chauvin accountable for what he did to George Floyd if you have policies that make it harder to do so? I feel like I should have been teaching a poli sci class, like I should
Yeah, right.
feel right now. But yeah, I know this is a hard question and it might be a little bit difficult to answer like right away. Um,
Cooking. It's cooking.
So what you're saying, how can we, as the general population, can keep those in power, speak truth to power, and keep them accountable for their words and their actions? Is that what you're asking?
yeah, especially in the face of laws.
Dude, well, that's been the dance, that's been the struggle since the beginning of this country and maybe even throughout human history. And so we're always, what's Lincoln's words, like, we're trying to achieve a better union. We're trying to get there, and that's why I feel like in the words of to borrow the idea of conservatism versus being a progressive, I think, by the way, both viewpoints are absolutely necessary. I applaud what you said, and I used to do the same when I would teach. I would hope we would hear all kinds of different opinions and then test them. They are a starting point, not a destination, not the end destination. Because by us reasoning together is where you hear different points of view, different ways of life, and that's how you come to a consensus. So my big deal right now, this is not exactly what you're asking, but if I, in a broader context, it would have to be to elect people who believe in nuance. We don't vote that way. We vote dog whistles. We vote black and white. We vote extremes. But if you don't like that, and poll after poll shows that the majority of Americans don't like that, then don't vote for it. Right now, there's a big fight in the Republican Party for the soul of the Republican Party. Which words do we stand for? Liz Cheney says, I stand for, okay, even though I'm a conservative, a staunch conservative, but I stand for what's true. The big lie is that, Trump won the election. It's a lie. But if the litmus test to stay in the Republican Party is to say, I bow the knee to a megalomaniac and his tantrums, if that's the litmus test, then Liz Cheney says, I fail. Mitt Romney says, I fail that test. So do we need those kind of voices, conservative and progressive? Absolutely. Right now, the conservative side is completely letting us down because they're not coming to the table with ideas. They're not coming to the table with this idea that we're going to work together and find consensus. And that's what the American people want. In surveys, they say they want it. Then you must vote for it. So when you've got someone who, like a Marjorie Taylor Greene, who gets elected, and then you're upset that government doesn't work, I think it's on us, frankly.
I love that, what you said, like in the whole bigger picture, being able to elect people who believe in nuances. That is so important and so wise, Jeff, because it's, it is black and white. It's dog whistle. It's buzzwords, right? And that's what we're voting for, the buzzwords. So it's conversations like we have that have so many nuances, and we go off into all these tangents, which are so awesome and important because we're able to find the nuances in what each other is even saying and question it and talk about it. And that's we look like world peace. We look like, right, the three of us right here. But that's going to take a lot for the world or this country to be that way, if it's even meant to be. But and who knows where this is all going to go. But what's important is definitely the present moment and looking at the nuances that are happening in the present moment.
So Sam, how do you so then okay. Man, okay, so then how
How do
do
we keep them accountable? No idea.
I don't know. I mean, not just that. Like, I think that because I think that's a really hard question to answer. Even for me, I think for anybody, it's really hard to answer. But I guess what I was, and this funny that I say that because I feel like this is even harder. But like, how do you fight against somebody who's in a position of power, right? If what you're trying to achieve is generally for the good of everyone.
For me, it's like I I'm different in a way where I couldn't even think of the word like how to fight it, but actually I think how to at least push my own values, in the way that towards the way of things that I feel like are unjust is I'm kind of like a person that does my research and like finds ways that could really like reach people that are near me, and through the groupings of people that have the same values, just like, people who protested and all of that, grouping these values together and doing your own research, and that's where the ideas and the nuances arise, and that's where you're able to find how to fight that. Because I think that how to fight it isn't something that can be discovered on your own. Can't save the world by yourself, right? Not one person can save the world. So really, like, marinating and researching and educating about your own values, like, draws a crowd. It draws a crowd to you of people that think the same way, and people in connection are our strongest resources when it comes to fighting the powers that be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I have Fernando. I've got three quick things to say
Yeah.
uh, because Sam has inspired me. You guys are both inspiring.
No, me too.
But
Yeah,
the
things
but
too.
the first thing I would say is don't be a hypocrite. Don't be a keyboard warrior. What in other words, if you believe whatever your passions are, check them, because does it serve others or is it only serving yourself? Is that what you're making a stand on? And then take that stand, but you got to go do something about it physically, actively, right? Secondly, I would say be willing to listen. I
Yeah.
don't know, this isn't a very sexy option, I suppose, but understanding where someone is coming from and not attacking right away, it does, it shows that you are worth having a conversation with. But then the third point would be sometimes you don't have the luxury of listening. Sometimes you've got to get out on the street. Sometimes you've got to take a stand, and people aren't going to like it. We've all seen those pictures, maybe over and over and over, especially around Martin Luther King's birthday, of how bad it was when the police were sicking dogs on innocent Black folks, or just marching a single Black student through hatred, and lines of people yelling the most vile, foul things in the world in a Christian nation, in a Christian state, in the name of Christianity. So that's where I feel like you can take a stand and you say, like, do you believe in Jesus, a swarthy Middle Eastern guy, homeless man? Do you believe in that guy or not? I think that it's not wrong to say, I call bullshit on you, because you say Jesus is all about the three-piece suit and the private high school that's all white with maybe colored folks on your sports teams. That's not Jesus, right? So decide, if someone's making that kind of a claim, there's another way that you can push back, and you can say, if you believe in America, let's say, you believe in the Constitution, if you believe in freedom of speech, which is what we're kind of talking about with protests, then how can you, pointing out the hypocrisy of that. And I love what Martin Luther King used to say. He says, we are finally living into the ideals that the founding fathers had, not their actions, but the ideals that they espoused, living to our better nature, our better angels. That's a challenge, by the way. That's not easy for any of us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then I think also to, I guess answer my own question too, but obviously this was like it's piggybacking from what Sam was saying, is like for me, and also just what you said right now too, JD. It's like there are three. I think that there are three like different levels through which you can do something, right? Because one of the things that we also have to recognize is that a lot of it does have to do with luxury or privilege of being able to do something. That you can approach an issue on a philosophical level, right? And that is to realize that sometimes, even if you don't believe in the philosophy of utilitarianism, which generally is just the idea that one has to maximize the overall good, right? That is consider the good for others or of others as well as your own, right? So that you are not more important than other people, but you're all important together, right? Um, that you can also approach it um, from a level of language, and to me, a lot of language is also now almost synonymous with like social media, right? So like, yeah, don't be a what did you say? Like a keyboard warrior, or I think that's
Keyboard warrior, yeah.
yeah, like don't be a keyboard warrior if that's all you're doing and nothing else, right? I meant don't be a keyboard warrior if that's all you're doing, but you have the ability to do something else, right? If that is the only thing you are able to do, then that is okay. Um, but I think that we have noticed that a lot of people do have the privilege and the ability to do more than just share information, right? Like there's so much more that you can do, even using your own privilege for something. And that third one would obviously be the physical act, right? It'd be the level of the physical act to go out in protest. When because for some people they have the ability to do so, and for others they don't have the ability not to, right? And I think that's a very important distinction to make too, because like um we look at a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests, or even like the Stop Asian Hate protests that happen. A lot of these groups felt like they didn't have a choice but to, right? Whereas someone like you, JD, right? Because you do have the privilege of being, I mean, like we both do have the privilege of being men, but like you have the privilege of being a white man, right? Like it gives you so much more that helps us too. And you do, right? Because you provide that, like you provide that help. You think of other people's good, the goodness of other people, not just your own. Um, and I think it is good to remember that you can approach it three ways. Like the philosophical one, I think is really important too, to realize that there are a lot of philosophies out there that teach you what it means to be human, because that is a really weird concept to think about, right? Because like what does it really mean, and like how do we approach it, and you know I mean, what is time, like everything is a philosophy. It's just nothing makes sense. um and that being said, I want to land on our last question, and this one I feel like is a pretty simple one to answer, hopefully. And that is, what role does the act of performance or performance ensemble play into everything that we talked about today, in terms of the right to protest, in terms of the power of language, in terms of holding people accountable? What does PE and performance have to do with this? What role do we play?
I feel like performance is just so great for any cause that you want to fight for, because with the performance, because there's protests, right? There's peaceful protests, there's all kinds of protests, but protesting with performance provides the nuances and the personal stories. Jeff, buzzword, nuance. And I think it's just like the best way almost to get the message across, at least to people who can resonate and receive it, because not many people will make the effort to see what that, like, the meaning behind it, or the effort that was made to share those stories. Like, this is the way to get to people's hearts. This is the way to show the truth and personal truths, and that's why I'm so proud of like what we've done in our time in PE. And you actually said just a few minutes ago, what does it mean to be human? And it's a line from Breach, from Breach performance, that we all, every single one of us in the group, in the performance, said together, unified, what does it mean to be human? And it's the most human way to protest, truly. And that's how I think performance plays a role in all that we've talked about.
Sam, I think I love your insights, and I think one thing that you said was not only for the audience to have a realization, but for you to have a self-realization. I had a friend of mine uh, go through a bit of that, and that they said, I just said something out loud that I always thought, but I never verbalized it. And now all of a sudden I'm hearing those words, and it's almost like it's just appearing in front of me, and it has a whole new meaning. So for PE, I think that for anybody watching and anybody who's ever been in PE, you have to draw forth, if you will, words, language. And sometimes by doing that, you really do have an epiphany of like, Yeah, that's really what I do believe. And by using certain, we're going back to language now, certain words, certain vocabulary, all of it's created, attached to meaning. And then, Sam, to your point, that meaning then transcends just here, it goes to other humans as well. So I think that's the power, one of the great powers of PE is that you get as you speak these words, as you pull out these words from within you, it brings them to the surface and you can recognize them in a new way.
Creates a ripple effect.
Yeah. I think that one thing that that I want to add too is I think that a lot of the role that PE plays is that it is. I feel like it creates an entire universe right in front of your eyes, and in that universe, you let go of your language and you become your language. And I know that sounds really hokey pokey, but like,
No.
I think a lot of people might be hearing this. It's like, oh, I don't think I can discuss the things that you guys are talking about and perform. It sounds like it's too much. And I'm like, I mean, sure, from the outside it does. And I'm sure it did for all of us when we first stepped in. Like it was cool, but it was still kind of weird, and you still kind of have to get adjusted. But eventually, you become your language, right? Like you become your words. Your words become powerful, and they become tools for change. And like that's how it happens. Doesn't happen in the blink of an eye. And I think that's the role that it plays. And I think another one too is not everybody is. I think proficient when it comes to argumentation, right? Not everybody is proficient in one-on-one or group discussions, but some people are proficient in, I think, decoding a message from a performance, right? Some people are proficient in consuming media and consuming entertainment and it causing a change. Like how many of us listen to music here? And to us, the lyrics are the most important thing besides just the instruments or the vocals, right? Like Sam, like, and this is something that Sam and I have in common to a lot of the music that we listen to, but like Turnover, for example,
Mhm.
it's changed my life, right? And like their lyrics may not seem so deep, but they're the deepest things that I've ever heard in my entire life, right? And so I think PE plays that role for some people too, where like you watch it and it blows your mind. Like it's the reason why we had so many people join us, even though we never asked them to, right? Because like we do ask people to join, but some people are like, "Yo, no, I saw your show 2 years ago, and I just decided why not." How many times have we heard that story before? We have. And I think that's the power that PE has in all of this, right? Like it allows for a different kind of conversation for people to learn and unlearn, I think.
You could say one thing or even have a moment of stillness that resonates with one person exactly. Like you could literally say their thoughts and you wouldn't even know it, you know? Like they could have a completely different perspective than you, but you say one thing or you do one act, you make one movement and it resonates with them and it changed and it creates change within a person. Transformation is
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to thank you guys for two reasons. One, for having that wonderful conversation. I feel like, I feel like this is a way for us to tell people, take notes. Taking notes helps. But two, also, I feel like this is the longest episode we've had where there was no guest. It was kind of insane. Um, Anyways, thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. This has been PE's in conversation with. My name is Fernando Martinez. I am one of three hosts.
My name is Jefferson Denham. I'm one of three hosts.
My name is Samantha Garcia and I'm one of three hosts.
Awesome. How do I stop?